and thanks very much everybody for coming along. We were saying just before that we're aware amidst all this wonderful work, and also you guys, that we're probably not the experts in the room. And so we're going to talk for a little while, and I hope as much it provokes other thoughts and comments, because there will be plenty of time in the second half of the evening for thoughts and comments. So please do pick up where we left off or challenge what we were speaking about without perhaps the fullest knowledge. But I think part of the point of these dialogues is that free form, almost improvisational element, trying to see where the ideas take us and what's just over the horizon of what is not actually said. And this reaches all the way back to dialogues from the ancient Greek world, which is part of my inspiration. So we should also just begin with our normal formula, because when we speak online, we normally greet each other just so that you hear the different voices, but we are aware that some of the people that listen, their best bit is when we say hello to each other for some reason. So I should say, welcome to the 102nd Rupert Sheldrake Mark Vernon dialogue. And today I am joined by Rupert Sheldrake. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Very good. So I thought one way to try and get into this is to look back and go back to the times when, of course, the idea that art might not be sacred just didn't make any sense. And this might have been actually for most of human history, which we'll probably return to. But with a thought on prehistoric art, and particularly the art of 30, 40,000 years ago that you can see, particularly in the caves of France, so Lascaux and elsewhere. And many things could be said about this. People might reference the shamanic. Nowadays, they might reference resonances with what's discovered in neuroscience. But it opens up for me what I feel is a really key principle when thinking about why these words, sacred and art, might go together. And that is the word sympathy. And this is a very resonant word for me. I think that part of what's going on with this very early depictions on cave walls in flickering light that the darkness of the cave enables, and then this overlaying of image, which if anything strikes you, it's the dynamism of the bison and the aurochs and the horses and the other creatures, is that stone and these pigments and then the lives of the people that made them are all coming together. The movement of the stone, the shape of the stone reflects the movement of the animals, that reflects again the inner lives of the creatures, of course, but also of the people that made these images. And I think this all speaks to a participative way of being in the world, which knows of its place in the world through sympathy. And sympathy, until relatively recently, didn't primarily mean a kind of emotional feeling, like I might have sympathy for you, you might have sympathy for me, but was much more broadly about the influence, the inflow of the spirits and the dynamics, the presences that existed and were perceived to exist in all things. And so this kind of art is not representational, I don't think. You need a much more recent mentality to think about work in that way. There's a sort of stance that you take onto something to represent it. But really it's a natural emanation or outflowing of that which is known, and known in this participative, sympathetic way. And it takes us to the Platonic encounter with these things, and Plato's famous wariness of what we can anachronistically call art forms. He particularly talks about in relation to poetry, that is more mimetic is more about a kind of imitation or representation. And I think one of Plato's concerns is that the presence, the parousia, as he would put it, of things gets lost when this sense of a sympathetic connection with things starts to become undone, starts to become uncoupled. He spots it early, particularly I think in relation to writing, which we might come back to. But I wanted to inject this notion of sympathy and flow and influence and inspiration, which is part and parcel of this participative engagement with things, which I guess must be part of sacred art before people even thought to call it sacred art. That already assumes some kind of uncoupling, was my initial thought, looking all the way back to these early, beautiful, I mean, Picasso famously makes this remarks when he goes into these caves, we haven't surpassed this work.
Well, I like that idea, Mark, and the idea that in the past there wasn't a division between the sacred and art. It was just part of the expression of people's culture and their life. And it wasn't about art, and it wasn't about artists, because we don't know who the artists were. So it was non-personal. It wasn't all about the artist. We're used to the cult of the artist. I think it's significant when you go to a great museum like the British Museum that what you find there is practically everything there was sacred art. It's been taken from temples and churches and mosques and sacred buildings throughout the world, looted and plundered basically, and then desacralized. The British Museum is really, and other museums, it's like a temple to humanity. It's built like a temple, looks like a Greek temple, but what's it a temple to? It's not a temple to God or the gods or the goddesses. It's a temple to the idea that humans could create all this wonderful work. And so when you go in, these pieces have been taken away from their context and taken away from a context in which you can see them as channels of the divine. And I thought about this particularly when I was in New Delhi once, and I went to the National Museum in Delhi, and they had these wonderful statues of Ganesh and of Lakshmi and so on, of gods and goddesses. And to my surprise, on the statue itself, or on the plinth, was all these flower petals that people who'd gone to the museum in Delhi had put offerings to the gods and goddesses. They hadn't accepted that these are stripped away and are no longer sacred. They're just works of art, enormously valuable, that can be bought and sold, or were originally bought and sold before they were encased in the museum. And I thought, what would happen if one went into the British Museum with a little bag of flower petals and started doing this in the British Museum and liberate these works of art and treat them as what they are, namely channels of divine vision, inspiration, something to help us in our spiritual journey. Well, I think I feel a bit the same in the National Gallery when I go those early paintings which are like icons. There's a real power there. And then I feel it fading away as you go through the Renaissance. And then even though you get sacred paintings in the 18th and 19th century, they don't move me. I mean, they're just sort of displays of artist skill. I mean, some of them are beautiful, but the most powerful for me are the earlier ones, because they were really done in that spirit of being a channel. And here in Britain, I suppose my greatest enjoyment of sacred art comes through visiting cathedrals, where you have sacred art on the largest possible scale. You're encased and engulfed in vast spaces, all of sacred art, all designed to expand the mind. Stained glass windows, soaring vaults, architecture. And then if one goes to choral evensong, my favorite service, then there's sacred music filling these sacred spaces. And thank goodness we still have this. I think it's one of our most valuable cultural traditions. So I'm absolutely 100% in favor of what's going on here. I'm a huge fan of the King's, and I think what the King's Foundation is doing with this art, keeping alive these traditions of traditional skills and the sense of sacred art is completely wonderful. And I'm blown away by this show that we've just been round this evening. It's so marvelous that people are actually doing work like this, which really connects with those traditions and inspires. And I think that what's important about sacred art is that it's based on the assumption that our lives are connected with the life of nature around us and with the source of our own minds and nature. In medieval Europe, in Christian theology, it was taken for granted that nature comes forth from the divine mind, and our minds come forth from the divine mind, and that the reason we can understand nature and relate to the world around us is because we have a common source. And a lot of sacred art is representing natural animals and plants, like in the caves you talked about, they're animals. A lot of art is the representation of plants. Gothic cathedrals, the columns are really based on the idea of tree trunks, the original wooden columns of earlier structures, and all the foliage coming out of the top of the capitals. It has this tremendously plant-like quality. And so does Islamic art, because in Islam, the prohibition on making images is really something that only applies to people and animals, not to plants. And so Islamic art really goes to town with these marvelous images of plants and flowers and arabesques. And I think that what's taken for granted in all these traditions, in the Indian tradition as well, is that all these things have a common source. And that common source in the divine mind, or however people conceive of ultimate reality, which is always conscious and very often to do with joy, bliss, and beauty, that the beauty of art is a reflection of the source from which all things come, as is the beauty of nature. And that's, I think, why traditional art has this quality of inspiration. I think it's why non-traditional art, modern art, that is conceived, some of it conceived of within a materialist framework, the modern materialist default worldview is, of course, that there's no God out there, no consciousness. We live in a purposeless universe of unconscious matter, of animals and plants we evolved by blind chance mutations and natural selection. And our own minds are nothing but the activity of our brains, all inside our heads. This extremely curtailed worldview means there's no possible source of inspiration outside human beings, because there is no spirit beyond human brains. And therefore it means that a lot of modern art is literally uninspired. It can't be inspired if there's nothing to inspire it. So I think that the sacred art and the traditions that are being continued here are extremely important for that reason.
Now, I felt that poignancy just coming in. It's a multi-layered place for me. My father was in the army, so the idea of coming into a garrison chapel brings back strange childhood memories. But coming in the room, and of course, you know, it's not a prefabricated garrison chapel like I often remember them, but with the rose window, and then it's deconsecrated, as Emma was saying, and yet it's full of all these traditional arts, many of which are, you know, very overtly, of course, from religious traditions. There was quite a poignancy to that. It took my mind to one of William Blake's best-known sayings about, without contraries is no progression. And I feel that we're in a kind of field in here, which is held by the polarities of, on the one hand, that this was once a chapel, and you even mentioned the columns with foliage, and of course we've got these Corinthian columns behind you with the acanthus leaves on top, and oh, you can see them here as well. So that sense of reaching back to very old religious sensibilities, and yet it did become deconsecrated, and then it's now used by the King's Foundation, and of course, those who have repurposed the chapel now are very aware of all that past. But the poignancy too is that it's a sort of gallery now as well. And linking back to what you were saying about galleries, I did a little bit of homework, and galleries for the display of art, funnily enough, the earliest reference to them that I came across, certainly in the European world, was in the Vatican. And the Vatican first opened galleries to exhibit a lot of the classical works, which in the Renaissance period, inspiring, in fact, a lot of the Renaissance movement, were being rediscovered as Rome was dug up, and people were lowered down into subterranean houses and villas and so on. And so there was a place needed to display this work. But of course, what was going on there was that an old worldview was being revealed once more. And I think this perhaps helped foster this Renaissance sense that you could become a spectator onto an object that originally would have been a divine presence. And so there's these, kind of very layered, almost ironies that it was the Vatican putting things on display, so fostering this spectator stance onto things, even as it stood for its own version of the sacred, from within the Christian tradition. And now here we are in this room, which was a chapel deconsecrated, but now is a gallery that is also exhibiting these works which have their own parousia, their own presence. And of course, that's very much part and parcel of these sacred crafts, these sacred traditions that the King's Foundation and those of you who have been part of that will so keenly be aware of and know. There's contraries coming together, creating this field. And I think part of the challenge, and maybe this is part of the invitation to us as well, Rupert, was, what can we make of this kind of in-between space that we're in a world very much shaped by the sacred, with its own artistic traditions shaped by the sacred, and what do these works conjure within us as, we're thinking back as well as thinking forward. And one element certainly for me is, what does it mean to be a spectator? William Blake was very alert to the notion of the spectator and speculating. He was born in the 18th century, this time of extraordinary revolution because of the Newtonian discoveries, the imagination being used to spot symmetries in the cosmos, the symmetry that we now know as the law of gravity. And this really blew people's minds, that in an elegant form, like an equation, which has its own symmetry, the equal sign is a kind of symmetry, a kind of sympathy across a mathematical formula, that these could be used to describe the natural world. And it unleashed this huge effort through the 18th into the 19th century and still today to spot these symmetries using the imagination of the sciences. And yet Blake, whilst recognizing that and recognizing its brilliance, remember, he always depicts Newton, just wait for that to die away, depicts Newton in a heroic form. He's celebrating it in one way, but also spotting the potential for narrowing that can come about because of the uncoupling that the spectator stance can foster and speculation can foster. He has lost one of his great figures in his own poetry and imagery, wrestling with his spectre, who is this kind of bat-like form that is a bit like what we would think of as his own inner voice now. And is the spectre going to lead him into more knowledge, a deeper understanding, or in that very moment of deeper understanding, also fostering the uncoupling, because the speculation would take him away from this more participative or sympathetic stance towards things. And so, I was thinking when we were going to be talking And of course, talking in itself has this very ambivalent quality. Do our words foster an invitation to participate once more with things that we're talking about? Or do words always run this risk of taking the step back, and so actually fostering a kind of distance even as things are talked about? So we're in a chapel that's now a gallery. We're amongst art that is very alert and aware to the sacred origins, even in the material manufacture, crafting, making of these things. Is it an invocation to write an icon? Of course it is. And yet when it's on a gallery wall, what's happening to that invocation? As we talk about it, are we seeking a way of moving beyond the words back into the sheer presence of these things? Or is this risk that as we talk about it, we foster this spectator stance as well? I think we have to inhabit this in-between world, try and enter these fields. I'm aware of who I'm talking to when I start talking about fields of memory and invocation. I hope, of course, that the invocation and the memory is alive and is speaking to us, even as we try to speak about it.
I think your point about spectators and the galleries at the Vatican is very, very interesting, because, as you say, the galleries at the Vatican were displaying classical art from Greece and Rome, from which the Christian culture was detached. And you couldn't sort of honor Apollo and Aphrodite and so on in the Christian culture at the Vatican. So you had to see them as distant and separate. And the same, I suppose, is true in Egypt today. I mean, the Islamic culture of modern Cairo is obviously very different from the culture of the temples and the pyramids. And so again, in Egypt too, you have the sense you're seeing a different culture, but not any longer alive. You're seeing a culture which was there, and you're a spectator. I think one of the reasons I so love India is that they've never had a disjunction like that. There's been a continuity because of the integrative nature of Indian culture. You don't, in India, look at an ancient image of a lingam or of a Buddha or of a Krishna or something and think, oh, well, now this is just from the past culture and now we're in a different one. It's all completely continuous. There's no break. And, various cultures have had these revolutionary breaks. China had the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution trying to destroy a lot of their cultural tradition and past. France had the Revolution and desacralized the cathedrals, turned Notre Dame into a temple of reason, and executed bishops, priests, and monks on an industrial scale. So there have been these cataclysmic breaks, but in India, one of the nice things about that culture is it's so integrative. You don't get that feeling, and that's one of the reasons I found it so attractive when I was living there. So I think one of the things that is important is to recover a sense of the inspiration that underlay these forms of art. And it's a bit difficult for us to recover that sense of inspiration with the classical Greek gods and goddesses. I mean, at least it is for me. It's much easier for things in the Christian tradition, because as a Christian, I feel really in tune, in sympathy with those. But I suppose one of the challenges for people in the School of Traditional Arts is, and I've no idea how people deal with this, is that if you're dealing with a traditional art form like Islamic jalis or Christian icons or Taoist-inspired Chinese paintings or drawings, to what extent do you need to share the belief system and the faith system that gives rise to that form of art? I don't know. I dare say this is something that people here have thought about, and I dare say it's an issue that comes up. And it may be that most people who do the traditional art do share in the traditions, but since everyone seems to do a bit of icon painting and a bit of Indian miniature painting, they can't share in all of them equally. Anyway, that's one of the things I was thinking about in relation to where we are now.
And I like your thought about the common source, because when that common source is known as divine in some way or other, I think that that helps to account for the great diversity that we see around us. Because the point about a work of art that invokes a presence, rather than say a rather didactic finger-wagging allegory perhaps, is that it can speak in its finite form of the infinite of which it's a reflection. But of course, because of the infinite nature of the divine, it's bound to manifest in myriad forms, bound to manifest in different traditions, and find its unity in a kind of triangulation. You know, you might have one work from, I can see two images even there. I know one's a Buddhist cosmology and right next to it is a Christian cosmology, from when I was looking around earlier. And yet somehow they sit together perfectly well when we're in a space like this with the intention that's behind them. And because that very diversity is not a problem, but becomes itself an expression of the common source. And so that bringing together, I think, is really very wonderful. I'm also, if I look in this direction, I'm aware too that there's images inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. And that brings me to another kind of linking up, that Dante's in this great tradition, I mean, in many great traditions, but one of them is, how can a tragedy also be a comedy? Which again is a great question from Plato. And the point there is that the tragedy is the darkness looked at unalloyed, you know, without flinching, and the suffering and the grief and the lament that that brings. But how can it be that you can know that side of life and know that it is held together in a comedy, which doesn't mean, you know, with laughs, although there are laughs on occasion, even in Dante's Divine Comedy, but more that there's goodness that outshines what is ill, that the light can survive even in the most dark of places. So there's good that outs in the end, truth and beauty and so on, therefore seen even in the telling of difficult things. And so that's another kind of holding together. And you mentioned the iconoclasms, you know, which we've suffered from in the West. And in a way, the iconoclastic movements, they keep returning, I think, because of this question. You know, can art hold together an infinite diversity of things? Or the impulse to destroy art often comes from the fear that it's not an icon, but it's an idol that's actually taking you away from the source, by the representation that is clearly finite and tangible and even framed, you know, limited. Does that take us away from the infinite source that we should be knowing, as it were, as creatures that can relate to the divine? So the iconoclastic impulse very much rests, I think, again, in this field that we're in tonight, when an icon becomes an idol, when the myriad multiple forms, people, for one reason or another, lose the sense that there's a shared divine source, and so can celebrate and rejoice in the diversity, and fear that you've got to choose one over the other. And of course, when you've chosen one over the other, you're not far off critiquing even the one that you've picked, for fear that that too is falling away from some kind of ideal. These things that we wrestle with, for some reason or other, much more in the West than, like you're saying, in India, where that doesn't seem to have been. I mean, maybe you can question that a bit, given what's happening with Hindu nationalism now, but nonetheless, there is a spirit there that seems to have survived much more fully.
Well, Keith Critchlow, who I greatly admired and knew, thought that one of the common sources of everything was, of course, geometry, and that he was a Platonist, so he thought that the geometric forms were in a kind of ideal realm, beyond space and time, transcendent archetypes reflected in nature. And I was actually just rereading his book on the geometry of flowers recently, I was rereading it because it was my birthday about 2 weeks ago, and somebody gave it to me, rightly thinking I would really like the book. But he hadn't noticed till he gave it to me that there's an endorsement on the back of the book by me. So I had actually got it already. I'm planning to give it away to somebody who I know will appreciate it. Anyway, that reminded me of Keith's book on flowers and how he sees geometry and basic geometric principles reflected in flowers, and of course in the Fibonacci series of the spiral series. And Keith was a great believer in the importance and the fundamental nature of geometry. And that's one aspect of the ultimate or transcendent, which is reflected in different traditions, simply because if these are eternal archetypes, then obviously people around the world are going to become aware of them and reflect them in one way or another. I myself am slightly less Platonic and less geometric in my thinking than Keith. And I've spent a lot of my life in research in biology. And one of the things about biology is that it's fortunately a fairly maths-free zone. You can't have an equation for a giraffe, and you can't have an equation for an oak tree. These things, you can have an equation for a rose flower, with 5 petals. The things that Keith concentrates on in his book are the parts where geometry does apply quite well. But most things in biology are not obviously geometrical. Very few animals are regular polygons or icosahedra and so on. So these Platonic forms, when you look at a jaguar or a spider or cockroach or beetle or a cockatoo, I mean, when you think of all the different forms in nature, they don't have a simple equation. And if you want to know what a plant is, and you find a new plant, you're not sure if it's a new species or not, the ultimate reference point is not an equation or a mathematical readout. It's going to the herbarium of the Royal Botanic Garden in Kew and comparing with the type specimen. So form, is the actual biological forms far exceed the limits of geometry. I mean, no doubt you could construct geometric forms or topologies for these, but they go way beyond them. And I think the imagination of nature, or the divine imagination, if that's the ultimate source of all these forms, is vastly greater than anything that can be codified geometrically. But it's interesting that so much of art has reflected these natural forms, as you mentioned in relation to those cave paintings of animals. So it's reflecting the fecundity of the natural imagination. There's so much richness in biological nature and indeed in mineral nature, but less richness in mineral nature.
I mean, the side of the Platonic that really speaks to me is that in this diversity, it may not be a geometric beauty that you see, but there is a beauty that you see. When you get the drawings that I guess you might see at Kew as well, of different species, plants and animals, it strikes you how beautiful they are, even as there's the diversity before you. And there's something about the beauty that calls, and maybe that's even why something that was drawn for scientific purposes in order to identify it in the sense of a kind of category. Still, there's a kind of invocation of the creatureliness, and this link between the sacred and art. It makes me feel, as you were talking, that we should talk about invocation as well. Again, I presume that whatever else was going on for the folk that put the images on the caves of Lascaux, it was some kind of prayer. This maybe would be the link back to the shamanic intuitions as well. And moreover, it's a prayer that brings together life and death, that brings together suffering and sustenance, that brings together kind of grief and also celebration. And I think this must be another way in which art with beauty linking back to the common source from which these contraries flow is worth holding in mind as well. I mean, another way in which I feel this, I was recently in Italy and near the town of San Sepolcro in Tuscany, and one of the wonderful things about San Sepolcro is and the environs there, is you can see the works of Piero della Francesca, often still in situ. So you can see his famous image of the resurrection in what was the town hall. And there's something wonderful about seeing it still in the town of San Sepolcro. Of course, the resurrection is Christ rising from the sepulchre, from the Holy Sepulchre. And so the spirit of the town and the imagery that's on the town hall is all part of the reason why Piero got the commission. But I love the Piero too, because it feels to me it brings together another kind of contrary, which is that of stillness and dynamism. And actually, of course, in Piero, who was a great writer on the Platonic solids, the geometric qualities that you can deploy in art in order to draw the attention, and perhaps unbeknownst even to the observer, but it brings a focus and brings, therefore, a kind of center of gravity to the imagery. And you can play with different perspectives. I'm talking to the people that know about this very much more fully, but there's different perspectives, say, in the one image that will give both a sense of the dynamism of one part of the image, but then the stillness of another part of the image. And I love that in Piero della Francesca, that you can see a scene certainly drawn from everyday life, but that carries the supernal element as well, carries the stillness in all the figures and in the perspective, in the dynamism as well. And I'm aware too that there's images over in that corner which are inspired by William Blake. And I think this is another thing that Blake could bring, that his imagery, you wouldn't say it was naturalistic, although clearly there's human forms and buildings and landscapes and so on. But what he's inviting you to do is to see these familiar things, but to see the spirit that might be in the familiar things. So, you know, when you see Blake weaving foliage through the words of his poems, for example, clearly there's not a geometric representation there, but there is a kind of balance, there is a sort of beauty, there is a kind of flow. And so even though he's using it in the way that a medieval writer of manuscripts might illuminate the page, when you look next to ivy, as it were, crawling up a wall, you almost see words moving between the ivy and what might have felt like very disparate forms. You can see how somehow, when you've looked at Blake, that they might come together nonetheless. So these themes of beauty, anyway, you know, still very much matter, even if the beauty is known in different ways.
I think another key feature of traditional arts, as we see here, is that they are made by hand. And that's clearly the case, clearly a part of human nature. I mean, the earliest artifacts we know about are various stone tools. Those go back, what, 1 million years, 2 million years, even before our present species. Neanderthals had stone tools. They probably also had fire. As some of you may know, there was a recent discovery reported in Nature about 2 or 3 weeks ago of the earliest known hearth and evidence for deliberate construction of fires and repeated fires, which was in Suffolk. I mean, it's perhaps amazing that the earliest use of fire that we know about happened here in England. I dare say someone will come up with it somewhere else soon. There'll probably an intense competition now. But this was dating back something like 400,000 years. This is a previous interglacial. Obviously not. The last ice age only ended about 10,000 years ago. Most of England was under ice 10,000 years ago. But going back further, they had fire and they had stone tools. And that means that part of human nature, not only our own species, but previous human species, had a large part of their mentality, of their mental activity, was making things. Most animals don't make things. And so just making things with the hand and achieving, there must have been a pride in work, because sometimes when you look in the British Museum at stone axes from the Stone Age, some of them are exquisitely beautiful objects, and in the Neolithic there were, wonderfully smooth and beautifully curved objects that, the earlier ones are cruder, of course, but there was a tremendous increase in sophistication and skill throughout that long period of the Stone Age. And in the Stone Age, people were probably also making all sorts of other things, weaving fibers and making things of wood, but those aren't preserved in the way that stone is, so we get a kind of bias towards stone. So again, it gives us something of that spectator quality, especially when you have old-fashioned museums with dioramas, with cavemen and so on. There's a feeling of being a spectator. But we also get that in relation to biological evolution. Not only the British Museum a kind of temple to humanity, but something like the Natural History Museum in South Kensington is like a temple to biology and science. And my friend John Michel used to make fun of that. He said, we Protestants are supposed to abjured the worship of old bones. And it was really amusing the way he saw the Natural History Museum as piled full of relics of extinct species, the bones which people would come into. It's a bit like a cathedral. You go in there, and there, instead of sacred objects, the bones not of saints, but of dinosaurs and all sorts of other creatures. So there we get that sense of spectator again, but also a sense of beauty, because these museums reveal to us the beauty of the natural world, including the beauty of skeletons and things we wouldn't normally see.
Did you say the fire was in Southwark? Just to double check. The fire, those remains?
In Suffolk.
Suffolk.
Not Southwark, no.
Oh, right.
No, sorry about that. No, Suffolk.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess that, these things might fade from consciousness, and some might say that we're moving into more progressive, positivistic times where those old superstitions are left behind, but they don't really die, I think. So when the museums are erected, even the bones are made to look beautiful again.
Yes.
Even if there's a sort of didactic impulse woven into that beauty as well. I'm wondering if we might begin to draw to a close.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that there'll be thoughts and comments that have been provoked by what we've been saying. So yeah, that seems like a good moment.